And this is a phenomenon seen in a lot of taxa, and it's seen on all continents across the world. But it is particularly common amongst birds, and especially in the Himalayas, where over 70% of all birds migrate elevationally. However, most of our current understanding of migration comes from long distance latitudinal migration. You would have heard of like bar-headed geese or these birds that migrate from Central Asia, from Russia, Siberia, all the way to India. That's what we know. Most of our understanding of migration comes from there. But we know very little about elevational migration. Thank you. Okay. And also what little we know about elevational migration comes from the neotropics, from South America, and very little, and where most of the elevational migrants are actually frugivores. But if you look at the elevational migration on the whole, and especially in India, in Asia, most of these birds are actually insectivores. So we actually don't know much about how insectivores migrate elevationally. So in the first part, I tried to use eBird data to describe diverse patterns of elevational migration in Himalayan birds. So what I used was eBird data. I used data from 2011 to 2024. I downloaded that data from eBird. As you know, eBird data tends to be messy. And so like Ashwin mentioned yesterday, you need to do a lot of data curation. You need to clean up the data so that it's usable for these kind of questions. I had a lot of protocols to clean up. I can't get into that detail right now, but I can share that later if anyone's interested. But I used data from eBird from the months of May to August to represent the Himalayan summer, and December to February to represent the Himalayan winter. And then I used a digital elevation model. So if you know, every eBird checklist has a latitude and longitude with it. And you can use what is called a digital elevation model to then extract the elevation that each checklist was coming from. And so I had the elevation of each bird in each checklist at a given point of time at a given place. The other problem with eBird data in mountain systems is that lower elevations tend to be more accessible to bird watchers. So all the data that we get from mountain ranges is biased towards lower elevations. So what I tried to do was use this resampling protocol where I chose only a certain number of checklists from across the elevation gradient. So if there were 10,000 checklists at the bottom and only 5,000 at the top, I would resample 5,000 checklists from the lowest elevation and not use all 10,000, and do that multiple times so that the error is reduced. And then when you have these resamples of checklists across the elevation gradient, based on all the elevations that a bird is seen in a given season, you can get at what the elevation range is. So the 95th percentile of all, 95% of all the birds were seen between a certain upper limit and a lower limit. That is considered as the elevational range of a bird in a certain season. And then you can know what the elevational range of the bird is in the summer, what the elevational range is in the winter. And then I correlated how these ranges might differ. So I put these ranges of individual species together, looked at how much overlap is there between their summer and their winter range, and then you get at these different patterns of how these species migrate. And then I tried to look at different traits. If certain if insectivores show a certain migration pattern, if larger birds show a certain migration pattern, these kind of things I tried to understand with the eBird data. So just some summaries here. I had a total of 75,000 checklists. After all the cleaning up that I had to do, we had a total of 75,000 checklists. Out of that, about 20,000 were from the eastern Himalayas and 55,000 were from the western Himalayas. I managed to get enough data for 377 species in the Himalayas. Out of that, 266 species were from the eastern Himalayas, 265 are from the west. These numbers don't add up because there are a new number of species that are there in the east and the west together, same species in the east and the west. One interesting thing that we found was that among birds that breed above 2,500 meters, high elevation breeding birds, nearly 65% of all of these species migrate elevationally in the east, and 74% of birds that breed above 2,500 meters in the west migrate elevationally. Now coming to some of the patterns that we observed. So if you look at these graphs over here, I have described 6 different elevational migration patterns, that is on the x-axis, and the ranges are on the y-axis. So the red color represents the summer range of the bird, and the blue bar represents the winter range of the bird. So as you can see, for residents, you see the elevational range in the summer and winter is largely the same, and that's what I'm calling residents. These birds don't move so much, and that's why they're called residents. Then we have something called displaced migration, where there's absolutely no overlap between a bird's summer range and a winter range. So what's happening here is that the entire population of birds that breed at higher elevations, they're moving down to lower elevations. So there's no overlap between their ranges in the summer and winter. Then we have something called shift migration, where there's some amount of overlap between the summer range and the winter range of the bird. So what could be happening is birds at the top are moving down and the birds in the middle aren't really moving, or it could be that the birds at the top are moving down and the birds in the middle are moving further down. We don't know what exactly is happening at the population level, but at the species level, this is what the pattern looks like. Then the next two interesting patterns are expand and contract migration. Here, I believe what's driving these patterns is this intraspecific variation in migration. So maybe some individuals of these species are migrating while the other individuals of that species aren't migrating. So as you can see over here, that the summer range is, for expand migration, the summer range is higher up, and you can see that the upper limit of their ranges in the summer and winter don't change, but the lower limit expands down. So what's happening is that some birds that breed at higher elevations stay back there in the winter, but there are some individuals that migrate down in the winter, which is why the winter range has expanded. Similarly, for contract migration, birds at the upper limit of their summer range, they kind of migrate down in the winter, but birds at the bottom aren't migrating. So you have this, some individuals migrating, some individuals not migrating, and that's why we get these two patterns. And then finally, we had something called upslope migration. Very few species showed this, but it was interesting that there were some of these frugivorous type species that actually moved up in the winter. So they bred at lower elevations, and in the winter they moved up. This could be because they were tracking certain fruiting resources. I'm not exactly sure what was happening here. In terms of diet, we found that insectivores mostly showed shift and displaced migration. Frugivores showed shift and contract migration. And residents, the birds that were residents were mostly these omnivorous and commensal type of species that eat all sorts of different things. They weren't dietary specialists, so to say. The other interesting pattern we found was that territorial birds were mostly resident. So what may be happening is, if a bird is territorial, they want to maintain these territories throughout the year so that they get better breeding success in the breeding season. So they're not migrating as much as less territorial birds. So those birds don't have to worry about maintaining territories all year round, and so they are migrating, but the ones that are territorial are not migrating, which is also pretty interesting. The other interesting thing is that residents tended to be larger than shift and displaced migrants. So resident birds, it is likely that we expect this to happen because generally larger birds are better at thermoregulation. They're able to conserve heat better, and therefore they are more likely to be resident, stay back at higher elevations through the winter, even though it's cold. Whereas the smaller birds, which are displaced and displaced and shift migrants, they are the ones that migrate. It gets too cold for them to survive. So that could be the reason for seeing this pattern. The other interesting thing that we saw is, so when you look at long distance migration, these birds need to fly really long distances. So their wing morphology is very different. They have pointier wings, which allows them to fly really long distances. But when you look at elevational migration, we saw no pattern over there, where that birds that were migrating elevationally didn't necessarily have pointier wings than resident birds. And this could be because when you're migrating elevationally, you don't really need to fly long distances. Most of the birds I study are actually just hopping down the mountain. They aren't really flying. So that is kind of the explanation for what we're seeing over here. So on the whole, summarizing what I understood from eBird data and about elevational migration in the Himalayas, a high percentage of high elevation breeders migrate downslope. The same species often show different migration patterns in the eastern and western Himalayas. We found that insectivores and granivores, birds that have very specialized diets, they are the ones that are migrating more. Territorial birds compete for high quality breeding territories, and therefore they don't migrate as much. And unlike long distance migrants, wing morphology does not affect a species' ability to migrate elevationally. So the second part is, now why are these birds migrating? We understood about how these birds, or what may be the reasons for these birds migrating. So in my next part of this talk, I'll be talking about how diet may be determining why birds migrate and why some birds don't migrate. So the Himalayas, as you know, is the largest elevation gradient in the world, with a lot of variation in temperature across the elevation gradient. And insects in particular, because they're small and ectothermic, they're cold-blooded animals, so therefore they're very affected by cold temperatures, especially at higher elevations in the Himalayas. The other interesting thing is that nearly 70% of all birds in the Himalayas are insectivorous, and nearly 70% of high elevation birds in the Himalayas migrate elevationally. So that's why insects are very important dietary items for these birds, and the availability of insects might be driving bird migration in the Himalayas. That was my theory. So what we see in the Himalayas is, at higher elevations in the summer, there's a lot of insects available. There's a short summer at high elevations, so it's like a temperate region, short summers. So therefore, you have a lot of insects available at higher elevations in the summer. But in the winter, at high elevations, it gets really cold. So these insects aren't able to survive. Whereas at lower elevations, insects stay rather stable. It doesn't get too cold, and the summer isn't too short. So you have stable insects at lower elevations. High elevations see this dramatic increase and decrease in insect availability. So what we think is happening is, many insectivorous birds track insect availability. These high elevation breeding birds are tracking insect availability by migrating downslope in the winter. But there are also some birds, some interesting birds up there at higher elevations in the winter that stay back. Despite insects not being available, despite it being so cold, these birds prefer and choose to stay back at these higher elevations through the harsh winter. So what my theory is, that in the winter, migratory birds are tracking arthropod availability downslope. But high elevation residents, because they're not able to find enough insects, they feed on a lot more fruit and nectar in the winter, because that's what's still available at that time. And there are some insects available at that time, and that's what they may be eating. So that's the theory that I went with. And I conducted this study in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary, which is this beautiful place in the western part of Arunachal Pradesh. It's part of the Eastern Himalayan Global Biodiversity Hotspot, home to over 350 breeding bird species. And we have a really lovely elevation gradient that goes from about 800 meters above sea level to 3,100 meters above sea level. The points you see along this gradient are the places that I sampled. You have different kinds of forests as you go up the mountain that I've mentioned here. So coming to my methods, so over 2 years, I had set up 20 mist nets at each of those 7 sites across the elevation gradient, and I caught 250 species belonging to 12 species. I focused on 12 species. 6 of them were high elevation residents, 6 of them were migrants, and I collected 2 things from these birds. One was blood samples from their brachial vein, and I also collected fecal samples. Now what I did with those samples, let me tell you in the next few slides. So I used this interesting thing called stable isotopes of carbon and nitrogen. So how this works is, I took the blood tissue that I collected from the birds, and how this helps is that, so when blood is being synthesized by the body, it represents what the bird or what a human has been eating at the time of when that blood was being synthesized. So say right now, if you collect blood from me, it represents diet. So blood in humans takes about 120 days to be replenished. So if you take blood from me right now, it represents what I was eating 120 days ago, about 4 months back. So if I take my blood and I take, say, someone else's blood sitting in the room, so I'm a vegetarian, I take a person's blood who's non-vegetarian, the isotope ratios of nitrogen will vary very differently between you and me, based on what we were eating back 4 months ago. So for that, we use this thing called stable isotope ratio of nitrogen, which is a proxy of trophic level, basically how carnivorous or herbivorous you are. So as you go up the food chain, the more carnivorous you get, the more amount of the heavier isotope of nitrogen is there in your blood. And so if you look at how much of that nitrogen is there in your blood, you can tell how carnivorous that species or that person was at the time when that blood was being synthesized. So what I did was, these birds the blood of birds gets replenished every 2 weeks. So I would go in the summer, collect the blood samples at that time, and that represents what the bird ate 2 weeks ago in the winter. And then I know how carnivorous the bird was in that season. And then I go back in the summer and I collect blood again, and then I know how carnivorous or herbivorous the bird was in that season. So what I predict in terms of trophic level is, because residents in the summer, there's a lot of insects available for them to eat, and they prefer insects. I would expect them to have a higher trophic level, means they're more carnivorous in the summer compared to the winter. And because in the winter they're eating a lot more fruit, their trophic level is expected to be lower. On the other hand, migrants, because they're tracking arthropod availability, they're tracking the insects available up and down the mountain, they're eating insects in the summer, they're eating insects in the winter, so they're likely to be carnivorous in either season. They're going to have the same trophic level in the summer and the winter. The other thing that I collected, like I mentioned, was fecal samples. That's their poop samples. And so from the poop, you know what the bird is exactly eating. Basically, the poop samples of the bird has DNA of all the things that the bird was eating. You sequence all of that DNA that's there in the poop, and you can understand what all dietary items they had, what insects they're eating, what plants they're eating. And then you do something, you compare the frequency of these different plants and arthropods that may be there in the diets of these birds. So what we do is, so say, take this bird. It's called a brown-throated fulveta. And say I collected 3 fecal samples of this bird in the summer. And as you can see over here, there are three caterpillars. 3 out of 3 of these fecal samples had caterpillars in them. And 3 out of 3 samples also had flies in them, fly DNA and caterpillar DNA. Whereas in the winter, for example, they had only 1 out of the 3 had caterpillar DNA, and 3 out of 3 of them had fly DNA. So what I interpret over here is that this brown-throated fulveta is eating less caterpillars in the winter compared to the summer. So that's what you can interpret from this, and this is how I've been interpreting my results in the upcoming graphs. So this is from the trophic level analysis from the stable isotope ratio of nitrogen. So you can see on the left is all the resident species, on the right is the migrant species that I studied, and you can see very clearly that high elevation residents are less insectivorous in the winter. So on the y-axis you have the trophic level. So you can see that it has a higher trophic level in the summer compared to the winter. But migrants, on the other hand, have a slightly higher trophic level in the winter, but largely very similar trophic levels. So what the theory I went with was kind of proved over here that the residents have a lower trophic level in the winter compared to the summer, because they might be eating more plant material like fruit and nectar. Coming to the results from DNA metabarcoding, so like you saw in the previous slide, the trophic level of these residents was dropping in the winter. And this may be because, so if you look at the y-axis over here, represents the frequency of occurrence, how often these different orders of insects were found in the diets of these birds in the summer and winter. The red color is summer, blue is winter, and you can see that there's a decline in the consumption of beetles, which is Coleoptera. There's a decline in the consumption of Diptera, which is flies, bugs, and caterpillars. So they're eating less of these orders of insects in the winter, which may be driving the decline in the trophic level in the winter. And the other interesting thing that I found was these birds, when there was less insects available, they were eating these fruits, these particular fruits that I've shown over here. They belong to the family Polygonum. They fruit a lot in the early winter in the Himalayas. And these birds seem to be substituting their diet with these fruits because they weren't able to find substantial insects. When you compare this to migrants, you see that they have you saw that they have very similar trophic levels in the summer and winter, with a slightly higher trophic level in the winter. And this makes sense because over here you can see that most other orders, they're eating very similar amounts. They're eating similar amounts of caterpillars, bugs, beetles, all of them, but they're eating slightly more spiders in the winter. And that may be the reason why the trophic level of migrants was higher in the winter, is because spiders tend to be more carnivorous. So if a carnivorous bird is eating something carnivorous, the trophic level goes even higher. So that may be the reason for why we were seeing a slightly higher trophic level of migrants in the winter. The other interesting thing that I found was that it didn't matter whether you were a resident or a migrant. All species had a lot of rhododendron in their diet. It's rhododendron in the Himalayas flowers en masse in the March-April period, and it's a source of instant energy. So all species of birds like this rufous-bellied woodpecker on the left, that is a resident, and this buff-barred warbler, which is a migrant, all of them feed extensively on the nectar of the rhododendron. So summing up what I found from the stabilized topes and the DNA metabarcoding was that migrants are tracking insect availability by migrating down in the winter. And residents are dietary generalists, so to say. Migrants are dietary specialists, residents are dietary generalists, and they switch their diets from eating mostly insects in the summer to more fruit and nectar in the winter. I try to think about how climate change, like as you know, the Himalayas and mountain ranges are at the forefront of climate change. And I try to think about how climate change might affect these birds and how it might affect residents and migrants differentially. So as you know that, as most of the people in this room would know, because of increases in temperatures in mountain ranges, a bird who prefers a certain temperature at lower elevations is forced to move up the mountain, because at higher elevations, it's cooler. So to track their preferred temperatures, they might be moving up the mountain. And then now, once they've moved up the mountain, they move down, say in the winter, to migrate. And now since they're migrating larger distances, what happens is, by the time, so a lot of these birds try to migrate back up to higher elevations to track the peak availability of insects. But what happens is, now that they have to migrate larger distances, by the time they reach up, that peak is gone. And so they may not be able to find enough food up there at higher elevations. So therefore, I think what's going to happen is migrants are going to be more at risk, because by the time they reach up there, there might not be insects available because of climate change related phenological shifts. Residents might be more resilient because they're able to switch their diets. They're more generalists in their diets, so they're able to eat whatever's available. So that may be one way of thinking about how residents and migrants might be affected by climate change in the future. So this is the last part of my talk, where I'll be talking about the work that our lab has been doing over the last 15 years in Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. We looked at how climate change and forest degradation together in a combined way affect population dynamics of birds in the Himalayas. As you know, climate change, land use change are some of the biggest challenges to biodiversity in the current century. And so to study how both of them affect birds, we went to Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. Umesh, my advisor, for his PhD, he had set up these 6 long-term plots in logged and unlogged forests. So in Eagle Nest, in the earlier days of when logging was still legal, there was a lot of logging that happened inside Eagle Nest for road maintenance. So there was a lot of logging inside there. So we found some sites that were logged. Those are the ones in red. And we found some sites that were not logged because they were, say, further away from the road. And these were more primary forests. And we looked at how species and how the microenvironments were different. So the first thing that we did was we put these temperature loggers in the logged and unlogged forests, the primary and the logged forests. And what we found was in the logged forests, it was warmer and also drier. So compared to primary forests. Primary forests were cooler and wetter. So you can see that the abiotic environment in primary and logged forests is quite different. And because of that, the insects available to birds to eat on is also very different in primary and logged forests. And so what we found was that in primary forests, birds actually spend less time foraging than in log forests, because the kinds of insects are different. There's also less insects available in log forests because it's drier and hotter. So we found that birds tend to spend more time foraging in log forests than in primary forests. We also looked at how the populations of birds change. So since we've been doing this study over 15 years, we're able to track the survival of birds over time. And so this can be done by catching the birds and putting these rings on them and doing this regularly every year. So we know how many birds we ringed in our first year, how many we have caught again in the next year, and so on. And this allows us to track the survival and the demographics of these birds. And over the last 15 years, we have caught over 13,000 birds belonging to 8,500 unique individuals and 139 species. Some of these species are here. The one in the center is a very famous one from Eagle Nest called the Bugunleo chikla. And again, just to remind you about how birds move upslope in the winter. So it gets really hot at lower elevations due to climate change, and so birds move up the mountain to track their preferred temperatures. And so the most of our sampling that we did in Eagle Nest was at the mid elevations, which is at 2,000 meters. And at 2,000 meters, we have two kinds of birds. One kind of species, group of species that are generally found at lower elevations, and their upper limit of their range is at 2,000. And the other kind of bird that we have is birds that are generally found higher than 2,000, but their lower limit of their range is at 2,000 meters. So what we expected at 2,000 meters is that the birds, if they're moving up the mountain at 2,000 meters, the birds that are at the lower limit, their survival declines, and birds that are at their upper limit, their survival increases, because the birds below are moving up, and the birds in the up are moving further up. And so we expected that these birds would show different survival trends, and this would give us proof for birds moving up the mountain over a period of time. This is one of the results we found, is that flocking species have better survival than non-flocking species over a period of time. So that this gives us an idea of, this is just an aside, apart from how climate change and land use change affects birds, this was an interesting result. We found that flocking has a survival benefit. So birds that flock together tend to find food better and therefore survive better than solitary species. Coming to the results that I mentioned earlier, you can see from these graphs very clearly. So the birds on the top are the birds that have the lower limit of their elevational range at 2,000, and the birds at the bottom are birds that have their upper limit of their elevational range at 2,000. And you can see that over a period of time, the birds at the top, all of them show a declining trend in survival, whereas birds at the bottom, you can see an upward trend in their survival, which seems to suggest that the birds from lower than 2,000 meters are moving up to 2,000 meters, whereas birds that were found at 2,000 meters and above are over time moving above 2,000 meters. However, this trend was only seen in primary forests. It was not seen in log forests. So what we think is happening is that you need primary forests. So if climate change affects birds and they have to survive by moving up the mountain, you need to maintain primary forests, because you don't see these patterns in log forests. These birds do not move up to log forests because it's, like I mentioned earlier, it's hotter and drier. So if birds have to move up the mountain to survive climate change, you need to protect primary forests at all elevations. And we've tried to use some of these insights that we had from these results, some of these insights to inform conservation action in the region. So you may have heard about the Bugunleo chikla, which is the first species to be completely new species to be described in India post-independence. It was described from this place called the Singchung Bugun, the village forest. And to protect this bird, the community came together and set up a community reserve, which is on the northern boundary of Eagle Nest Wildlife Sanctuary. And because of our results that if we need to protect these birds over the long term, we need to protect community forests, we need to protect the primary forests at all elevations. We worked with the local community over there, and we were able to convince them to expand the community reserve to cover a larger elevation gradient. So that now if over the next 30, 40 years, if it gets warmer, there's habitat for the Bugunleo chikla to go further up and survive climate change. So that is some of the outcomes that we have had from our research. And I would like to thank the support of numerous agencies, the Forest Department in Arunachal Pradesh, and all the people mentioned here. And of course, none of this work would have been possible without our amazing field team. A lot of them have been working with us for the last 15 years, and they know so much about the biology and ecology of all the species in Eagle Nest. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you. You have just taken 1 minute extra, so.
Went a bit fast.
It's a very interesting presentation, and I think this is something which we probably don't study too much. There are places where altitudinal migration takes place. Even in South India, Western Ghats, altitudinal migration does take place, which I have noted anecdotally, but we need more studies to prove it. Because when I was working in Pichi, I used to see in monsoon season the presence of two birds. They have come from the higher altitude, but in the summer months they are not there. So I don't know whether monsoon or the rainfall pattern also affects this, because you only looked at insect.
In the Himalayas, I think it's mostly. So I think in the Himalayas it's mostly temperature related, but as you go to more tropical places like the Western Ghats, I mean we don't have any information from the Western Ghats, but from the Andes, a lot of what we know about elevational migration is because of the rain. So when it gets very rainy at higher elevations, a lot of these birds move down. That's what we know from the Andes. I'm sure that similar things might be happening in the Western Ghats as well.
So here is a topic for people interested in doing research. You can start some research work on this aspect also. Yeah. So now I throw the session open to people. If you have any questions, maybe we have 10 minutes to answer the questions. So anyone wants to ask any question, please. Sure. Yeah.
Sir, ഒരു മിനിറ്റ്, ഒരു ചെറിയ അറിയിപ്പുണ്ട്. ബാലസൂചിക വേദിയിൽ ഡോക്ടർ CS ചന്ദ്രികയുടെ കാന്തൽ എന്ന നോവലിൻ്റെ ചർച്ച ഇപ്പോൾ നടന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുകയാണ്. താല്പര്യമുള്ള വ്യക്തികൾക്ക് ചർച്ചയിൽ പങ്കെടുക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. താങ്ക് യു.
I was just wondering about the warblers. They're becoming nectar feeders, or why do you think, what are they feeding on from those rhododendron that are showing up in their
That's
diet?
tricky. I mean, I think they're feeding on the nectar, but they could also be feeding on insects in
And
the
getting
nectar.
pollen or something?
I don't know what they do with pollen. Is that also
I mean,
food?
as byproduct of eating insects, I'm wondering.
Yeah, I mean, that could be the case as well, but I mean, you see a lot of them going, like flocking to rhododendrons. So, especially during the flowering season, I've seen tits and warblers go to rhododendron.
Interesting.
I don't know if, I mean, it could also because it's a energy-rich source, and it's also just at the end of the winter. So it's suddenly this energy-rich source that's there at the end of the winter. They might be also feeding on the nectar, but it's hard to tell whether what they're eating inside. Could be insects as well.
They're
but
putting their face inside
they're
the
putting
flower.
the entire going deep inside. It's not just on the edges.
Yeah, on this topic, I just wanted to comment that even in South India, even in the plains, you do see birds flocking to flowering trees like the butia. And Salim Ali himself has mentioned that you just go and sit under a butia tree, you will find all the birds coming in. Even strictly insectivorous birds come and drink nectar. So when energy is available freely, I think why not use it? So that may be the policy. And of course, they may take occasionally insects also.
Hi, Tarun.
Hey.
Tarun, great talk. Just a comment on the threats which you felt that migrants are more threatened than resident species. The phenology also is changing, right? So,
Yeah.
in relation to that, the residents may also be a threat. And are there any studies on the phenology changes related to climate change in the Himalayas, or is Umesh doing something to understand what threats residents may face when they...
No, we have not done any phenology work, at least up there. There's a lot of Aprajita's work at NCF from the lower elevations, but from the higher elevations, we have not done anything yet. There's some evidence to show that rhododendrons are flowering earlier and earlier, and that might have some effects. But I think overall, I don't know of research that's looked at broad, like long-term data sets at high elevations in the Himalayas.
Any other questions? Okay.
For this territorial information, you use the ring data or the
No, so
presence?
there's this data from secondary sources.
Ah.
So I forget, I think this was the Elton traits data set, one of those trait data sets. I think they've just used a lot, like say the handbook and Birds of the World, all of them, they use that to come up with this rubric of territorial, highly territorial and seasonally territorial. So
in
that's
that case, it would be better to, when you talk about the eBird data sets, I was wondering like how we can inference those kind of things, better to put in this other side, right? Much more relating to the context.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi Tarun, great talk. I was just wondering, because there was so much of interest about what the birds might be feeding on, whether it's nectar or insects. While using meta-barcoding, do you think for specialist insectivores versus frugivores, when these are in flower, relative proportion of insects versus evidence of rhododendron, can we comment a little bit on that?
So the problem is with the DNA-based analysis is, even if it's eating insects, since the insects are also probably feeding on rhododendron, that DNA also ends up coming up in the analysis because, yeah, so it's hard to tease that apart. The only way I'm saying, making any sort of conclusion is because of the stable isotope work, that even though they're feeding on rhododendron, the trophic level isn't dropping so much. So they might be, even though they're feeding on rhododendron, they might be feeding on insects. So a little more intense study on some of these strictly insectivores versus frugivores to see, and then look at how much rhododendron they're feeding on, and then look at the stable isotope ratios and see if you're seeing any differences there. That may give you an idea of how much rhododendron they're actually feeding on. Yeah.
Yeah, incidentally, the two migrants that I noticed, altitudinal migrants in Western Ghats, both were frugivores.
Frugivores, right, yeah. And all the altitudinal migrants in the tropical Andes are also frugivores.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So if there are no questions for Tarun, we can move to the next talk. Thank you, Tarun. It was great. Thank you, everyone. So the next talk is by Dr. Anusha Shankar. She is going to talk about light, heat, and birds. Birds that can switch on and off. Dr. Anusha Shankar is a reader at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Hyderabad. Her research focuses on how animals, particularly hummingbirds, use torpor, a hibernation-like state, to conserve energy. Her lab studies show how tropical species such as sunbirds, nightjars, and moths manage their energetic needs amid changing environments, with collaborations in Arunachal Pradesh. Currently, her team is also exploring the effect of artificial light at night on nocturnal birds. Passionate about mentorship, she has guided over 30 students in recent years. Over to Anusha.
ഇത്രയോ?
എല്ലാ സൗന്ദര്യാത്മകമായ സാധ്യതകളോടും കൂടി ഇപ്പോഴും പുറത്തേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ കഴിയാത്ത ലോകത്താണ് നമ്മൾ നിൽക്കുന്നത്. സ്ത്രീ അവളുടെ ജീവിതം വിളിച്ചു പറയുമ്പോഴും ഇപ്പോഴും ഏറ്റവും പുതിയ ആളുകൾ പോലും ഏറ്റവും പുരോഗമനം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഏറ്റവും മൂല്യവത്താണ് എന്ന് ചിന്തിക്കുന്ന
I'm excited to share a little bit about the work that I've done in the past, and then I have a very new lab. We are 2 years old, so the work that we're planning to do in the future with birds in